Hello, thank you for joining us for ShipIt. This is our virtual event where we bring engineering shop folk together to talk about the things they're working on and take questions from all of you that have joined us today. With conferences being postponed and things going virtual, we wanted to create a place where we can connect with you online. My name's Anita Clark. I'm the managing editor of Shopify's engineering blog. Today, we're talking about engineering and management mental models. We're going to learn how to create a game plan for identifying, understanding, and applying mental models in your day-to-day. My guest is Shopify's second most famous man, Hamad, and he will guide us through this. We're doing it a little differently today. We will have a Q&A portion after the first half of the presentation and another one at the end of the presentation. So get your questions in on the chat, use the Q&A mode for us. We're ready to go. So Hamad, it's really great to have you here. Welcome.
Hi, how's it going, everybody? Thanks so much for everyone who could attend. So a bit about myself. My name is Hamad, and I've been at Shopify for almost 6.5 years. I've gotten to work on a lot of different projects over the years, but what I currently work on is this app called Shop. Shop is a top 5 shopping app in the App Store. You can track all of your online packages in one place. You can discover new products. When you pay with Shop Pay, we actually offset the carbon emissions that are created by that delivery. So it's super, super interesting. Check it out. So despite all of my work, I am unfortunately known as frustrated man on computer because of this stock photo. And you might have seen me in different parts of the internet. If you're the organized type and are about to get a divorce, you might have seen me on this website that asks you to create a checklist and be more organized. You might have seen me on this lovely website. I think this is a self-help site that tells you to blame others because you'll learn a lot. All right. So, maybe after this, I'll do a talk on how to create a healthy web presence. But today we'll focus on mental models. And you might be wondering what mental models are and how they might be relevant to your life. So we're going to get right into that. One thing that you pick up really early on as an engineer is that things are changing all the time, whether it's the language that you're using, the frameworks that you're using, your organization, the people in your team. And a big chunk of our jobs involves change management and keeping up with information. Now, there's multiple ways of doing this. You can either just keep trying to learn all of these new things that come along. But I think a better way of doing this is to understand the core principles at the foundation of all of these ideas and learn those instead. Essentially, you're spending time on things that don't change. Now, if you study bright people, we see that they do this as well. For example, Charlie Munger, who's a famous investor, he credits most of his success to all of these principles. If we look at Richard Feynman, who's a famous physicist, he applied the same 12 algorithms to most of the things that he came across, and he was really successful because of that. You obviously know about Elon Musk. He refers to this as thinking by fundamental principles. So when you're problem solving, you go down to the base layer and work up from there. So this talk is essentially learning more about mental models and figuring out how you apply it to the rest of your life and your career. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be going over 3 topics. The first one, we're actually given mental models, like how do you actually apply them to your life and work? After that, we're going to be looking at some examples of engineering mental models. And then we'll be going over management mental models. So I'll dive into the first topic now. So you may be wondering, if you have all of these mental models, how do you actually use it in your life? And how can you apply it to your work as well? So when you're thinking about how to position yourself in your career, one thing you could do every day is just treat your job like work, clock out at 9 to 5. I think that's a wrong approach. What you really want to be doing is treating your career as a way of calibrating your judgment over time. So you're going to do different things, you're going to learn lessons, you're going to make mistakes, but along the way, what you're going to do is calibrate your judgment. That's really important, because if you had to start at zero, I think the most valuable thing would be your judgment. Like, given anything difficult, can you figure out the right thing to do? So, but you might be wondering, like, how do you actually do that? Can you calibrate your judgment? What are the different steps? To help with this, there is a really, really good book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And it essentially breaks down our two modes of thinking. One of them is system one, the other one is system two. System one is fast, it's unconscious, it happens automatically. If I ask what's 2 plus 2, that's system one. It happens automatically without any effort. It's essentially your intuition. System two is slow and methodical, and you can only really work on one thing at a time. Now, the super interesting insight from this is that you can actually use your system two to influence your system one. Whatever slow, methodical work you do on a day-to-day basis actually ends up improving your intuition over time. So that's a really neat idea, and we're going to work with that. With that, what you want to be doing is, like, if improving your intuition and judgment is important to you, it has to be a part of your day-to-day. Like, you can't just treat this as something that you do once. If you want to do this, it has to be a part of your day-to-day. So we have to come up with systems that apply to your life. So we're going to talk about three things. We're going to first go over how do you discover and prioritize new ideas. Then we'll look into how you can organize these mental models, and then also looking at how do you actually apply them to your work week. So for this first part, I'm actually going to be sharing my screen, and you can organize this information however you want. I use Notion, and I find it super useful. So I'll share my screen. Here we go. So Notion is really, really awesome because you can have different views for the same information. You can get this cool Kanban board, and you can have these cards sorted by importance. And whenever you run into some important idea, you add it here. And this is an example board. This is also useful if you've joined a new team or a company and there's all of these terms and you're trying to make sense of them. You can add them here and eventually prioritize them. The way prioritization is handled is that you can have this board be sorted by any field that you create yourself. And in this case, we're going with importance. And as things become more important, you bump them up so they'll be sorted higher, and that's how you know that this is more important. For example, if you've been playing Factorio recently and you realize that if you're not automating everything all the time, you're doing it wrong, then this becomes more important and it becomes sorted higher above everything else. And now you can spend more time thinking about how to approach this, what is the right way and what is the wrong way. So when you have all of these ideas, I like storing them in Notion as well. It has this really, it's a really great way of organizing information. You can use toggle lists. They can have more nested toggle lists. You can have, call outs, tables, all of that. They can also link to further pages. So it's a really nice way of organizing information, and you can have mental models of whatever you're interested in. These are just some examples. I like this concept of an idea dojo. So whenever you first run across and come across an issue, you have this temptation to think that that's the most important one. Because of a recency bias, we think that recent things are really important. So what I do is I put that idea here, and as it becomes more useful to me, or as it proves to be more useful to me over time, then it becomes added to the core list of ideas. So once you have these ideas, then going back to our initial idea, you have to apply it to you have to have some sort of a system so you're applying it regularly. Otherwise, it's not really going to, it's just going to be a checklist and not really a part of your intuition. So what you want to have is some recurring event, whether it's, every Sunday when you're planning your week, or when you're stuck, or when you have a big decision coming up and you want to make sure you have things correct. That's when you use mental models and apply them to your life. So I'll stop sharing my screen and go back to the presentation. There we go. Let's stop sharing this and go back. Okay. So this is where we left off. And that was my cue to share my screen. I hope that gives you a good summary of like how do you actually apply these models. And now we're going to go into engineering mental models specifically. By the way, I'm going to be focusing on a few models that I think are interesting to talk about in this medium. But if you want more details, if you want a bigger list of models, go to shopify.engineering and search for mental models there. And there'll also be links to this will also be posted in the chat as well. So we're going to get right into it. There's about 10 mental models, engineering mental models in this presentation, and then we're going to go into management ones. The first idea that I think is incredibly important is avoiding silent failures. Now, whenever we're building complex systems, we can have this false sense of security that things are just working correctly, but they might not be. And you want to set up a system where when things go wrong, you should know about them, even if it's annoying, even if there's a lot of alerts. It's generally better to know when things are going wrong. And that's important because small silent failures can actually show you larger structural issues within your system. Now, one way of doing this is like to be constantly looking for things that could be broken, but obviously you don't want to be doing that all the time. So what you want to set up is a system where computers just tell you when things are broken. You want to set up automated alerts and have those alerts go to team communication channels and whatnot. Another way to think about this is silent failures typically happen when exceptions or errors are rescued and then they're silently ignored. So look out for that. You could have frameworks or libraries that are configured so that they don't raise an exception. Another important idea is that you want to log exceptional cases all the time. For example, if you have a method or a function and it does a bunch of work, sometimes it'll return early because there's some exceptional case instead of doing the actual work. You always want to log for exceptional cases. And that ends up being really useful because when something goes wrong, you want to know if something, it didn't go through the right flow and it returned early. So with that, another really important problem to consider in tech is that people have this tendency to want to rewrite everything all the time and move to this new tech that came along. So how do you actually make that decision? John Duff, who was previously at Shopify, came up with this model which ends up being incredibly useful. So the idea is that you actually invest in new technology when it enables something that wasn't possible before, or it makes something much, much easier. And that's good because having fewer trusted technologies ends up being a superpower. It means that people can move between teams really well, and so people tend to stay in companies longer. It means that as different groups come up with libraries, these libraries can be shared, so you have greater leverage, and this ends up having a lot of stabilizing effects in your organization as a whole. This model ends up having really, really interesting performance, stability, impacts throughout your system. And the core idea is that instead of, if a request comes in, instead of working on it right away, you work on the core parts that are, the minimal core parts that are important and queue the rest of it. And that's important because background job systems are better at handling failures. Like if something breaks, background job systems will retry. So the core logic is actually done in background jobs. Now, there's other side benefits to this. Because you're doing like the minimal upfront work, the actual response time for your request will be really fast. And that means that your system can handle burst traffic really, really well. And it also reduces the scope of things that can go wrong. Because you're only doing the minimal amount of work in that initial request, as your system evolves and you add new things, those things are added into the background job. And failures there are handled in a much better way. Now, I think root cause analysis is something that Shopify does really, really well. the core idea is that instead of treating failures as something shameful, you actually treat it as an opportunity for the whole team. And it ends up being incredibly useful, but you just have to frame it correctly. And the idea is that when something goes wrong, you try to learn from it, you improve your tools instead of blaming people. So you do this in a blameless way. You get everybody together, or the people who are involved in the incident. You describe the timeline, you describe what went well, what didn't go well, and then identify the main causes, and then you ask why a bunch of times. By asking why, you will identify a few times, you will identify the root cause, and the solution that you come up with is applied to the actual root cause instead of some that being a Band-Aid solution. As you're coming up with designs for new projects, even if you're testing a specific class, you have to pick between competing options. And I think it's always better to pick the solution that's the most testable. The reason is that if something is more testable, it's typically more annoying to test. And because of that, people are less likely to test it. If there's a flow that's doesn't have automated tests, and it's really annoying to test, that is the thing that's most likely to break. The reason is that as your system evolves, it gets more complex, there's more flows, and people will be less likely to test the thing that's annoying. So in the long term, what you want to have is the flows where you can test them with automated tests, or at least that they're not annoying. Safety valves end up being incredibly useful when there is an incident. When there's an incident, you want to be in a position where you have more control over your system. You can relieve pressure. You can turn off certain aspects of the system. So when things go wrong, the first priority is that you have to prevent further damage. And sometimes you have code in place to do that, and sometimes you don't. You can't predict everything. And in those cases, what you want to do is be able to toggle safety valves or kill switches. There's different terminology for this, but the core idea is that these are things you can toggle without deploying a new code. You can turn these on and off with environment variables or whatever other setup you have. We do this with a process in memory and a database-backed cache. Perceived performance is super interesting. Like obviously what you're trying to do over time is like maximize the performance of your system. But what you're really trying to get at is 100 milliseconds, because that's after that users start to notice that there's something slow. But for any sort of any non-trivial app, this is actually really, really difficult to do. So you have to figure out how to make this work. The interesting thing is that there's actually a difference between the performance of your system and what the user perceives as the performance of the system, and you can take advantage of this. One example of it is like as a website loads, you're showing placeholder content and then loading, the more expensive thing on top of that. Likewise, in apps, the apps feel much more snappier where they show a default screen first and then something else is done on top of that. This is related to the model of doing minimal upfront work and queuing the rest. It's really the same thing. Early on, you're showing some minimal placeholder and then doing the core thing in a background job after that. As your system gets more complex, you're going to have to figure out how to scale reads and writes. Writes end up being even more difficult to scale, and there's a lot of different approaches to this. So I'll go over a few. First, you want to have a system that avoids multiple flows that are updating the same row. If you're updating the same row, there's lock contention and things will back up. So you want to avoid that if possible. If you're sticking with relational databases, you can split your database up into multiple parts. These are called shards. So different data is grouped in different database, and this helps you avoid writing to the same tables. If you have the option to go with a NoSQL database, that's an interesting choice as well. Relational databases do a lot of work to ensure that your writes are durable. They'll essentially write to disk or have some sort of a mechanism of knowing that if something goes wrong, database is restarted, it'll come back up with the same rate. And NoSQL databases, depending on the database or their tuning, don't have these same strict requirements. You can tune them, but often they favor availability instead of durability. And that means that you can write more frequently to them. I find that some NoSQL databases complement relational databases really well. Like there's some use cases where you have to write it in a durable storage, while others, like if these are stats or temporary data, it doesn't need to be in a perfectly secure data store. It can be in something that's optimized for writes and speed. So that can be really useful as well. When it comes to communication between two parties, you should never trust input unless you validated it. And let's go through an example where I'm communicating with someone else. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. First, what I want to do is authenticate that or ensure that that person is who they say they are. Then I want to make sure that no one's snooping in on our conversation. If this is on a public network, so if this is on the internet, if this is on the internet, you could still have the case that we have encrypted communication, but there could be someone sitting in the middle and seeing those encrypted bytes. Someone could capture those bytes and manipulate them. So you want to have a system that can prevent manipulation of data in a public network. Again, if someone captures those bytes and replays them again and again, you want to have a system that can look out for replays and avoid those. You could also have the case where a trusted party intentionally or unintentionally sends malicious data, so you have to account for that as well. But generally, you shouldn't trust input without validating it first. Now, the last engineering model in this presentation is failure modes. And these end up being incredibly important because they force you to change the way you think. We have this thing called a confirmation bias, where whenever we come up with an idea, all of our following ideas, because our brain's trying to save energy, all of our following ideas are validating that initial idea. And if you're coming up with a system, that can backfire because you didn't really explore the full set of options. So failure modes are incredibly useful because they force the mental exercise of like, how can I be wrong? What are the things that can go wrong? And you should be thinking like min-max. Like, what if there's no data flowing through the system? What if the system's down? What if the system's under capacity? Likewise, you can think about maxes as well. Like, what if there's a lot of data flowing through the system, more than you anticipated? How do you relieve pressure? How do you handle overflows? Interestingly, if you work with product and UX folks, most of their time is spent on the expected case, because that's where users spend most of their time. As an engineer, you actually have to spend a lot of time on the boundary cases too, because that's where you will spend most of your time. Most of the errors actually happen in the boundary cases. And again, think min and max. So I've been talking a lot for a while, so we're going to take a little break with this. I think this is a live stream somewhere that I think is about having proper posture. So let's consider this a public service announcement for all of us who are watching, and just fix our postures. I'm lucky because I have friends at work who give me these insights, and I am always made aware of these. It's great. So I believe now might be a good time for an intermission and a quick round of Q&A, and then we can move on to the management mental models.
Yes, thank you, Hamad. That was great. So let's start with our first question. Okay, the dropped new technology is very strong. How do you talk to people who make the decisions off the ledge?
Maybe that person can clarify. What do they mean by off the ledge?
From making the wrong decision, basically, of going for that new technology instead of understanding that this isn't the best thing because it's nice and shiny, instead of like, no, let's stay with the tried and true because this is what is necessary for the business type of thing. That's
a great question. And I think I've been on both sides of that question, where I've been trying to convince someone to use a new tech, and I've also been on the other side where I had to walk, convince someone not to, and it ends up being really, really challenging. And in the tech industry, sometimes it's better you can really benefit from trying out new things and being on the cusp of new technology. So that's sort of the tension, and we have to figure out how to balance the two. So I've had this discussion before, and I think what was useful was pointing out the leverage that you get if everybody's using the same tech. Now, say you create a new team, and this team uses a new set of technologies that no one else has. And if you keep following that, if that keeps happening throughout your organization, a lot of your organization is going to have tools and technologies that are really optimized for that use case. And that means that as a developer, eventually you're going to want to move teams, and that's going to be really difficult because every team has a different set of technologies. And also, you lose out on a lot. Like if our team builds interesting libraries, now we can't really share that with anybody else because they're using other technologies. So on the flip side of that argument, and this is why this is interesting and there's nuance, is that sometimes it does make sense. For example, most of the backend code in Shopify is in Ruby. Most of our data organization uses Python. And we do this because the web ecosystem for Ruby is fantastic. That's not true for Python, but the data ecosystem for Python is amazing. And so from that perspective, if your project is going to be focused in a domain where that ecosystem is better, that might be a better call. And there's many examples where we're actually experimenting with new technologies, but before, and this is always a tough conversation to have, so I'm not sure if this is a good answer, but I think you have to consider all of the nuances, but default to having your trusted set of technologies. And if a new thing has to be introduced and other people are going to use it, you have to properly vet it.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer. Our next question is, wouldn't queuing work in the background add to latency to the response time?
That's true. It does. If you're optimizing for immediate performance, then it makes sense to do the task right away. So it really depends on what you're optimizing for. Sometimes you need sometimes performance is the most important metrics. Other times resiliency is more important. An example of this would be if something is a user-facing request. If we're getting a user-facing request, what we want to do is respond to that as quickly as possible, because your response time actually has an impact on how if users keep coming back, what they think about the quality of your apps. There, I would say yes, you have to optimize for performance. Then there's other cases where these are these requests are created by automated systems, or whether it's like Kafka, a message bus that's creating these requests, or it's like other automated systems that are creating these requests. For them, performance is not important, but it's more important that your system is durable. So,
great.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we move on to your second part of the conversation, wow, that's a big mug, man. Let's do one more question, and that is, how do you decide between a relational database and a NoSQL one?
So there's a bunch of different factors that go into this. The first thing that you should do is, if you have a good understanding of the requirements, and we're going to go into that a bit more, you will be able to figure out the read and write patterns of whatever it is that you're about to make. That will inform what you need to pick from. If you need transactions, you kind of have to stick with relational databases. If it's a really write-heavy system and the durability requirements are fewer, then you can go, will you have to pay an extra overhead for deploying this new system? Like, is your organization good at managing this data store? So all of that sort of goes into this equation of what you end up picking.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go back to your presentation. Sweet. And remember, ask questions during Hamad's presentation for the end, and we'll have another round of Q&A. Okay,
so we'll go into the management section now. Thanks for sticking around. Compared to engineering, management is really different. It's different because it's a lot more fuzzier than engineering. You have to calibrate your approach all the time. So like what might work for me might not work for you. And that's really important to consider. Ultimately, it's really different than engineering, and that's why a lot of people have trouble with it. But I think mental models end up being incredibly useful here as well, because I'm going to share some examples, and doing the opposite of them will always be wrong. So they add a lot of value. So the first core idea is that you have to align incentives. And I'll go into detail about what that means. But generally, what you're doing is growing people. If you think about management as growing people, things just work out really, really well. And an example of this is you want to figure out what makes different people click and point them towards that. And over time, you're calibrating your approach. You're coming up with a general approach for yourself, but you're also coming up with a specific approach for other people. And an example of what that means is, if you can take advantage of personality tests, they end up being incredibly useful. So there's the type 5s, in Enneagram tests, there's the type 5, the investigator. They're gifted at solving problems and really digging in. And what they need from you is they don't want you to be overbearing. They want you to be around and give them ideas, but not in an overbearing way. On the other hand, you have type 6s. These are the loyalists. They are really good at thinking about all of the things that can go wrong. What they need from you is constant support, and also the feeling that you're trusting them with something important. So these are two separate strategies that you have to use for different personalities. And then you have to, again, incorporate that into your general approach of managing people. There's a really, really good miniseries on Netflix called The Last Dance. It's about Michael Jordan's team and all of the different players that he had in his team, the different personalities, and how they interacted with each other. The coach, who I think would be the manager in this case, how that person handled all of these different personalities and got them to click in a way that was productive. Super recommended. And this is really, really important too. If you can get this right, I think most of the other things end up being easy. So we often hear like, hey, what does this person want? Or what do you want? Or, you hear this a lot. And that's true, because I think everybody has a good sense that what the other person wants really dictates what they're going to do and how they're going to approach work. So and we all understand this at a deep level. And so you really want to account for this. In the ideal scenario, you want to be aligning incentives. So what the relevant entities want is the same thing. If that happens, everything works. For example, you want to find the intersection of, if you're thinking about work for your report, you want to find the intersection of what does this person want? What do they want to grow in? What are they looking forward to? Excuse me. And then you want to ask about what does your product or your immediate team need? And then you also want to think about what does your company need? If what the person is doing is at the intersection of these three things, it'll work out really well. If you have the case where the person is doing what the product wants and the company needs, but not what they want, in the long term, this leads to resentment, and that can lead to burnout. If the person is doing something that they want and doing something that the company needs, but it isn't aligned with their immediate team, then the team's needs are neglected. And that, again, can be bad over the long term. This also applies to the company as well. So like if I'm doing something that I want and my product needs, but it's not aligned with the company, in the long term, that's going to send us down the wrong path. You can also have cases where the person's only doing an overlap of two of these or just one of these, and that's not a good long-term strategy. So ultimately what you want is to align incentives. And on the same point, like when you're thinking about how to properly grow people, and I think a really good approach is to first start out by like the things that they're good at and the things that they're obsessed about and what they gravitate towards, and also understand the important complementary skills that they're missing. These are their growth areas. What you want to do is get them to lead with their strengths. And that's important because that will give them momentum, that will give them confidence, that will help them really build trust within the rest of the organization. And when that happens, now you can start to kick off projects where that are helping them address the complementary skills, growth areas in the background. We have this thing where we tend to focus more on the negatives and the positives. Like we hate losing stuff more than we like winning things. And I think this also applies to our approach to management as well. And one thing you want to do is be mindful of that and account for that. For example, if one of your reports is doing a bunch of awesome things and they had made a couple of mistakes, if you just focus on the mistakes, they're not going to feel appreciated because the net value that they're adding is much greater than you're giving them credit for. And I think this also applies if you're thinking about reports that are struggling. One thing we tend to do is like focus all over time on the report, the people that are struggling instead of amplifying the high performers. I think you'll be better off by amplifying the high performers because you'll get an order of magnitude higher impact from them, while bringing a low performing report just to the regular scale, they're going to perform at an average level. So I think it's better to amplify high performers, and you got to have different strategies for approaching that. If you're building a product, you should understand the why behind it and communicate that with your team. This is really, really important because it counteracts the broken telephone effect where communication breaks down in different ways. It counteracts entropy where things go towards chaos unless someone's actively looking out for them. And the reason why that works is that knowing a general direction of where you should go helps you pick between competing options. And even at a tactical level and not at a strategy level, it helps you make the right decision. And more importantly, it also tells you where not to go, which ends up being even more useful. As you're coming up with a design for a new project, I think it's really, really important to get the requirements right early on, and then come up with a game plan for those requirements. This is important because it's frustrating for a team and it hurts the team morale when they make something and the requirements change and then you kind of have to throw away something. And it ends up being a bad thing in the long term. So what you want to do is get the requirements right early on. You see this in interviewing as well. Like people who spend like the first 5 minutes of their interview just planning tend to do much better because they know the general direction that they want to go in instead of just going in random directions. And I think this also applies to if you're, building an organization, building a new product, coming up with a tech design for something new. The second aspect of it, you also have to communicate this with everybody. Like if you understand the requirements and there's some game plan, but nobody knows about it, there'll be a lot of anxiety and unknowns, and people are going to have longer meetings. People are going to have more meetings until they really get this down. One mistake that people make when they're new managers, excuse me, is that they try to be very efficient with people. And that's because engineers are usually wired to seek efficiency in different places. It's a great quality in engineering, but not in management. In fact, it can have the opposite result. I think about it as the shortest path when it comes to people is not the path of least resistance. So just quick feedback, it may be like the shortest path, but it might actually have the counter effect. So you have to build rapport before getting to work, and that ends up being really great because Slack conversations sound better. Like they sound like people talking instead of random arguments, and people assume positive intent in different conversations if you've gotten to know that person. So I think it's worthwhile to ease into conversations, let people get more calm, and then they'll talk about the things that are actually on their mind. When it comes to hiring, what you want you want to create a interviewing process where you can use the interviewing process to identify 3 signals. Are they smart? Can they get stuff done? And are they good to be around? The first 2 are maybe obvious. The second one is interesting because second one's important because you could have a really bright person who's not doing a whole lot and they're not adding value to the organization. And at that point, it's not worth it. And you got to have different interviews to get signals of the past work that they've done, their initiative, if they're an intern or if they're new, like, are they showing initiative? If they've been in the industry for a while, what's their track record like? The last one is super interesting, good to be around because it can be filled with personal bias. Generally, what I think is always true is you want to avoid hiring brilliant jerks. I think in the long term, they wreak havoc on your team and on your ecosystem because people don't feel good about coming into work. So, and the nice thing is now we don't actually have to, we're not limited to picking those. We can pick people who are all 3. And what that creates is an environment where people like coming into work, they can get stuff done, they can be productive, and it's a healthy environment for everybody. If you're building a team, the ideal scenario for you is if everybody acts like owners. And if you've been in organizations where you've had both, you see the immense difference between the two. Like people who act like owners add so much more value than people who don't. They're not treating this as a job, but they're going out of their way to figure out what works in their product, what doesn't. They're always there to help and end up adding a lot of value to everybody. Then the question is, how do you make people act like owners? And 2 things that work really well are giving them transparency and control. You want to give them transparency because they should have an insight into how decisions are being made, what's important. Once they kind of know what's important, they will want to make action. They'll want to act on it. And unless they have control, they'll want to act on it, but they won't be able to. And then they'll remove themselves from the situation and be more passive. So if they have both transparency and control, they'll know what to do and they'll actually follow through on it. Now, the flip side of this is, other than giving them control and transparency, you also have to hold them accountable. And this is tough for a lot of people, and it really depends on your personality type. This could be more tough for certain people. But you're tempted to let bad behavior slide because that's an easy thing to do. But in the long term, it really creates a culture where those bad things are okay. Like you're sending an implicit message that that's okay to do. So you have to draw the line somewhere. You have to, it's fine to make mistakes, but you have to know where that line is, and you have to make sure that deal breaker deal breaker rules are always enforced. So I think that was the last slide. Yeah. So as a summary, what we went over was we first talked about how do you actually integrate all of these ideas into your life and work. Then we talked about engineering mental models, and then we talked about management mental models. And again, as a reminder, these are available. If you're looking for more and more detail, have a look on shopify.engineering, and you can search for mental models there. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamad. That was awesome. We're taking questions, and obviously you can ask specific questions about this section of the presentation or any other sections of the presentation. We have 15 minutes, so let's get started. Okay, our first question, and I have some comments that I'm also going to share with you too, Hamad, from some of our audience that you can comment on. Okay. Our first question is, how do you deal with people who aren't receptive to these models? I know Ray Dalio would say to fire them, but it's not always that easy.
Yeah. So I think your models and your approach has to be calibrated for who you are. And there's a lot of different factors at play. Like Ray Dalio is in a position of authority. He is the CEO of the company. So the advice that he gives you is different than the advice that I'm going to give you, because we just have different approaches to work. And again, the things that work for him isn't going to work for me. And you can argue, and I think the reading between the lines, what Ray Dalio recommends is like, I believe he calls it radical truth and radical transparency. And the core idea there is that it's always better to say the truth. It's always better to be transparent about everything. And the point that I've shared is like, you got to ease into it. You got to have rapport. So he's really bright, and I don't want to turn this into an internet argument. But I think if
I'm going to share this with him so he can like find you.
Yeah, let's tweet at him after. I think there's a bunch of different factors, but if you look at the churn of people in Bridgewater, his company, it's like the numbers are insane. Like 25% of the people leave within the first 9 months. And it's not an environment that's for everybody. And I think he can get away with that because people aren't really going to question him on being, on saying the exact thing that he's thinking. I think if you're building an organization, you have to take into account what people think. Like if you want to establish long-term relationships with people, if you want people to stick around in your team, of course you have to care about what they think and like catering your response to them. So I think it depends on the context and it depends on who you are.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, our next question is, are there specific models you apply or focus on during specific portions of a project, design, build, etc.? Do you mental models shift throughout the process? If yes, is there any specific examples you can share?
Interesting question. So I personally use mental models. I typically use them at the beginning of a project because I think it's really important to get the early that part correct. And I think some examples would be like getting the requirements right, making sure you have the right team members on that team, questioning your failure modes to make sure that you're exploring all of the different options. I think other than those, the models that I have for engineering specifically apply in all situations. Now some of them, I guess, apply as you get bigger, as like, for example, the scaling models really kick in as your project matures, and that's the appropriate time for them. But you could argue that maybe you should take those into account early on. And, if you're predicting that the read and write patterns of your system are going to be in a specific way, maybe you should take into account your horizontal scaling strategy at the outset of your project. But I think it depends on the context.
Great, thanks. Okay, so our next question is, I wonder how you give control to people without affecting delivery or production. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Great question. So what you want to do is make people act like owners, but as they're doing that, just like you're calibrating your approach, they're also calibrating their approach to work. And while doing that, they're going to make mistakes. And but what you want is to create self-sufficient teams. You don't want to be the bottleneck of anything. And you have to be okay with people making mistakes, as long as the outcome is that then they figured out what not to do. And as long as you have a process for like, okay, we missed this deadline. Now, this is why, this is what we're going to do in the future. That ends up being a better long-term strategy, because if you are always, the bottleneck of like, hey, we need to get this done by this, give input here, that's not really going to improve your reports. Like, what you want is to build them up so they really have the same skill set that you have as well.
Awesome. Our next question kind of is like one of those comments I mentioned, and then there was a follow-up question. So Tim, thanks for making this comment here. He says, I wonder if the core model here is understanding the why helps align people. Perhaps the broader question to my comment is, what is your approach for defining these mental models?
What is my approach to defining these mental models? So there's a couple of different things. First, as you're looking at this presentation and you're looking at all of the reference material that we shared in the chat, you might be tempted to copy all of the mental models. And I think that's actually not the correct thing to do. The lessons that we truly learn are the ones that we've made through mistakes. Or if you're really bright, you can actually read books and, put yourself in that position and then like create models from that too. But ultimately, the things that you've come up with yourself are the ones that are going to be the most impactful for you. I think what I've found is, understand the why, and understanding the why ends up being really, really important. And then communicating that with a team ends up being really important, because I know cases where I haven't done that, or I've done that and seen the awesome impact that's had. So I'm not sure if that answers the question correctly, but I think you have to come up with things yourself, and you got to have some sort of a system in place to refer to these mental models, and as they are repeatedly useful to you, then they like upgrade in your tiers of what you consider a mental model. Like initially what they're starting out are just like abstractions or like vague ideas that you think are interesting, right? Like I played Factorio, and I think that automating everything all the time is the way to go. But if I then try to apply that to different things, maybe that doesn't work with people. Maybe that only works with systems. So you kind of learn about the nuances of it as you start to apply them, and then you can refine them into some things that are always true, or some things where doing the opposite will always get you in trouble.
And is this a little bit of trial and error too? Like you can take examples from, like Elon or Ray or something, and try them out and realize that they don't work, or they need that tweaking for your situation. Is that how you've applied them in your situation?
That's exactly right. I think engineering is like more stable. So I think if you pick up good ideas from different sources and books and what have you, those you can most likely apply constantly. I think engineering is really fuzzy, and it's entirely dependent on your role. The world has different expectations from me than it does for you. And I think it's important to take that into account when you're coming up with something like a mental model. So all of the management models come with a caveat of they're optimized for me and my personality type. maybe this answers the earlier question. Ray Dalio has a different personality type, and he can approach things differently than me. And I guess another idea is, then if you're reading books, the books are optimized for the author. So you should try to get your information from different sources, apply it to yourself and your life, and see what makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is, for teams that are learning some of these engineering models for the first time, what are some strategies to help them incorporate it into the code base?
That's a really awesome idea. I've mostly applied this at an individual level. For example, over the years, if we have some important event coming up and we have to prep for it, I do an exercise myself to think about all of the edge cases, and then I share that with the team in templates. Like in Google Docs, you can create templates for that are the templates that you come up with are informed by mental models. Now, I guess the underlying question is, how do you get the conversation started? I think the thing that you're really trying to do is make sure that people take a step back and think about how they're approaching their work, and not just fall into the next thing. You don't want to make decisions automatically. You want to have, for important ideas, you want to have sort of barriers and okay, this is what we think. This is how we arrive to these conclusions. If you want, it could be a sort of a team process as well. I've personally found it useful at a personal level, but I think, it really depends on your team and how receptive they are to these approaches.
Great, thank you. We got 3 minutes. Oh, sorry.
One idea that I had, a really, really long time ago, this is when I was early in Shopify. I was asking Jume about how to give good feedback in pull requests. And because the way you give feedback in pull requests ends up being really important, it's important to get that right. And I think what he said was to refer to principles like single responsibility principles. If you reference known models in conversations, they frame the conversation in a very specific way, so people know where you're coming from. It's sort of a shortcut. Instead of writing a paragraph of what you think, you can write this thing, and it's a shortcut of a lot of context, of previous context. So I think you can apply that here as well. If there's certain models that the team thinks are always true, then you can reference that in conversations and pull requests, and it makes things a lot more efficient.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, it's our last question. Thank you for everyone that's been here. Here we go. You mentioned horizontal scaling before. When should you start thinking about it? And would you do this at the start of a project?
There's a few things to consider. It's actually really challenging to halfway through your project then introduce horizontal scaling, because you have to invest a lot of time into it. You have to make sure that you do it correctly. You have to have your models set up so that so when you're sharding, when you're horizontally scaling based on something. In Shopify, it's shop. We horizontally scale based on shop. In other apps, it could be the user. But you could also have the case where your models are connected with each other in a way that's really tightly coupled, and it's hard to pull them away. So you want to be in a position where if you have to horizontally scale, you can horizontally scale based on some entity, the user, for example. So I think what I would recommend is in your early research, understand the read and write patterns of the system that you're about to create. And if you think that write capacity is going to be an issue, maybe this is something that you take into account really early on. You probably shouldn't horizontally scale in the first year of your project. Well, it really depends on your growth. But you could potentially think about that and create your models and the relationships between those models in a way that allows for horizontal scaling down the road.
Awesome. Okay, we're at 2:00. I want to thank you, Hamad, for being here and sharing all this great knowledge on the management side and the engineering side. Again, check the blog post. There's a lot more models there that you could explore. There will be a copy of this webinar posted on the engineering blog, and I will also be sending everyone that signed up for the webinar email when that's available. We're hiring, obviously, so check out the career page, and you can also learn more about our digital by design principles. You can now work from pretty much anywhere in the world with Shopify. The link is not in the chat because I didn't put it there. Sorry, folks, but you can search the career site, Shopify Careers, and it will bring it to you. Thank you for everyone for spending this hour with us. We are so happy that you could join us and share in this presentation. We'll be sending out a survey. We want to know how you feel and what we can do to make this better, and topics that you would like to see in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hamad. I hope all of you guys have a great afternoon.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Take care.